Meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, new orientation for reformed multilateralism. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General and the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Algeria, Argentina, Armenia, Australia, Austria, Azerbaijan, Bangladesh, Bulgaria, Chile, Cuba, Ecuador, Egypt, Estonia, Ethiopia, Georgia, Germany, Guatemala, Indonesia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Italy, Japan, Kazakhstan, Kuwait, Latvia, Lebanon, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Malta, Morocco, Nepal, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, Poland, Portugal, Qatar, the Republic of Korea, Romania, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Singapore, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, Switzerland, Thailand, Turkey, Ukraine, and Vietnam to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite His Excellency, Mr. Chaba Koroshi, President of the United Nations General Assembly, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2022/880, a letter dated 25 November 2022 from the Permanent Representative of India to the United Nations, addressed to the President of the Security Council, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, strengthening multilateralism to address today's global challenges has been my highest priority since assuming office as Secretary General. My report on our common agenda and the process it has initiated are aimed above all at reinvigorating multilateralism to deal with today's interconnected threats. Mr. President, even during the darkest periods of the Cold War, collective decision-making and continuous dialogue in the Security Council maintained a functioning, if imperfect, system of collective security. The international system created after the Second World War succeeded in preventing a military conflict between the major powers. States armed with nuclear weapons cooperated to cut their numbers, prevent proliferation, and avert a nuclear catastrophe. Peacemaking and peacekeeping by the United Nations helped to end conflicts, saving millions of lives. Notwithstanding this important progress, we are still grappling with many of the same challenges we have faced for 76 years. Interstate wars, limits to our peacekeeping ability, terrorism, and a divided collective security system. And at the same time, conflict has evolved dramatically. We have seen fundamental changes in how it's fought, by whom, and where. Lethal weapons are cheaper and more sophisticated than ever, and humankind has the capacity to annihilate itself entirely. The climate crisis, on the other way, is now contributing to conflict in a host of ways. The negative implications of digital technologies are proliferating. Misinformation and hate speech poison democratic debate and fuel social instability. Many elements of modern life are weaponized: cyberspace, supply chains, migration, information, trade and financial services, and investments. Frameworks for global cooperation have not kept pace with this evolution. Issues quickly become zero-sum and polarizing. Our toolbox, norms and approaches need upgrading. Mr. President, the UN 75th Declaration asked me to make concrete recommendations on a broad range of threats on land and at sea, in space and cyberspace. In response, as part of my report on our common agenda, I proposed a new agenda for peace, and I hope to submit this to Member States in 2023. The new agenda for peace will take a long view and a wide lens. It will speak to all Member States and address the full range of new and old security challenges that we face, local, national, regional and international. It will examine ways to update our existing tools for mediation, peacekeeping, peacebuilding and counterterrorism. And it will also look at new and emerging threats in less traditional domains, including cyberspace and outer space. The new agenda for peace will recognize the links between many forms of vulnerability, human rights, state fragility, and the outbreak of conflict. It's our opportunity to take stock and to change course. Because business as usual does not mean things will stay the same. In a world where the only certainty is uncertainty, it means things will almost certainly get far worse. The new agenda for peace will aim to address a host of tough questions. It will articulate a vision for the United Nations work in peace and security for a world in transition and a new era of geopolitical competition. It will set out a comprehensive approach to prevention, linking peace, sustainable development, climate action, and food security. It will consider how the United Nations adapts its peace and security instruments to an era of cyber threats, information warfare, and other forms of conflict. It will look to Member States for new frameworks to reinforce multilateral solutions and manage intense geopolitical competition. It will call for new norms, regulations, and accountability mechanisms to strengthen the multilateral system in areas where gaps have emerged. And it will consider how we can further engage with non-state actors, including the private sector and civil society, to meet the challenges of our day. The new agenda for peace will also consider how the UN's existing toolbox can be enhanced. The Black Sea Grain Initiative shows that the United Nations still has a unique and important role in brokering solutions to global challenges. We must build on and expand such innovative approaches. Our existing tools and operations also have enormous value and have contributed to saving many lives. We must do everything we can to invest in them and adapt them to new realities. Where they fail, it is often because they are asked to do the impossible. And I look forward to further discussions with Member States on this important process. Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, preparing for the future is a challenge for the entire United Nations. The Member States are working with determination to evolve the intergovernmental organs depending on the needs and realities of the present day, and I welcome the negotiations that have been taking place in the General Assembly since 2008. A majority of Member States are now conscious that the Security Council should be reformed to reflect contemporary geopolitical realities. I hope that the regional groups and the Member States will be able to work together to achieve a greater consensus on the path to follow and on the modalities for reform. The organization and I myself stand ready to provide the necessary support. The Council is already benefiting from the new working methods that have been put in place, including open debates and informal mechanisms which aim to strengthen collaboration with the entirety of the UN's membership. The contribution of women's rights organizations in the Council has helped us make headway on our prevention work and strengthen our response to current conflicts. Consultations that are open to a broader range of stakeholders, including women's rights organizations and persons affected by conflict, displacement, and human rights violations, can only benefit the work, the influence, and the credibility of the Council. I also note the calls from Member States for the revitalization of the work of the General Assembly and the strengthening of the Economic and Social Council in the context of a reformed multilateralism. The General Assembly has demonstrated that it plays a vital role in bringing Member States to consider the questions that are on its agenda. This year alone, it has adopted many important resolutions, including on the war in Ukraine, the right to a healthy environment, and the use of the veto by the members of this Council. Regarding any decision from member states aiming to rationalize the practices of the General Assembly, resolutions, the presentation of reports, the functioning of the committees, or to strengthen the work of the High-Level Week of the General Assembly, the Secretariat stands ready to provide its support. Regarding the Economic and Social Council, the proposed biennial summit between ECOSOC, the heads and state of government of the G20, the Secretary-General, and the international financial institutions would be an important step towards the better coordination of global governance and the creation of a global financial system that is adapted to today's world. Mr. President, the challenge to be overcome is clear. We have the opportunity and the obligation to remember the promise of the United Nations Charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. We must keep this promise with the help of a revitalized, effective, representative, and inclusive multilateralism. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Chaba Karushi.
Thank you much, Mr. President. Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I thank Minister Jai Shankar and the Indian mission for organizing this critically important debate. I also commend India and the 4 other outgoing Security Council members, Ireland, Kenya, Mexico, and Norway, for your important contributions to international peace and security over the past 2 years. Mr. President, we are at a watershed moment for multilateralism, at a historic crossroad. The international rules, norms, instruments, and institutions that have guided interstate relations for over 75 years are facing deep, sometimes you would say existential questions of relevance at a time when the world needs the most. But as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, grappling simultaneously with the climate crisis and protracted debt, food, and energy emergencies, one thing is clear. These global challenges are far too great for any one nation to handle alone. Our best hope, our only hope, is always to find a multilateral solution designed in line with the United Nations Charter and international law. Let us recall that the actions you take here in the UN impact the 8 billion people out there. You are to improve the lives of the people who count on you, and you are to do so at the time of profound global change and polarization. But, Excellencies, just as your actions have profound effect across the globe, so too does your inaction. Inaction in the General Assembly, or more frequently, in the Security Council. Too often, sharp geopolitical divides have prevented responses and progress in the Council. The question I have for this Council is simple. Will these rifts continue to upstage your collective ability to maintain international peace and security? A reminder of our mission hangs above you daily. Will you choose Percock's phoenix rising from the ashes of war? Or the pain and destruction depicted in Picasso's Guernica just beyond these doors? Mr. President, multilateralism can work, but it must work better. The 193 member states of the General Assembly have placed their trust in the 15 of you. As members of the General Assembly and of the Security Council, they elected the majority of you, entrusted the rest of you through the Charter. They expect each of you to act for the good of all, to uphold the UN Charter. You have done so in countless occasions. In doing so, you have saved countless lives. Just last week, you decided to establish a humanitarian exemption across UN sanctions regimes. This will have a direct impact on so many people living under dire conditions. Yet, there are examples of failed collective actions as well. And let me mention just one of those. As we approach 10 months of the war in Ukraine, not a single Council resolution has been adopted to mitigate the exact type of crisis the UN was created to prevent. Excellencies, for the UN to reinforce its relevance, its raison d'être, it must deliver solutions for the end users, for all of the 8,000 million of them. The people we serve do not really organize their lives into boxes labeled human rights, development, or peace. It is our responsibility, individually and collectively, to respond to that complexity. It only makes sense that we collaborate across bodies, organs, and processes, and build on efforts already underway. This so-called veto initiative has opened an important door for the new form of collaboration and accountability. The Assembly has been obliged to step up when decisions by the Council are blocked. Following the mandate given by the Member States, I will always convene a formal debate on the use of veto in the 77th General Assembly. This will allow Member States to reflect on the initiative, on how to bring our two organs working closer together, discharging their functions in support of both peace and prosperity. Outside this chamber, Member States are participating in 15 negotiating processes on the range of issues from counterterrorism to health, sustainable development, and digital governance. Several of the co-facilitators sit around this table today. One of those processes is the intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform, with the participation of all 193 member states. It has been a mandated duty for the General Assembly for many years, but the outcome is still less than what was expected. During the high-level week in September, more than one-third of world leaders highlighted the need for Security Council reform. I fully support today's focus on tangible steps that member states can take. I ask each of you, as members of the General Assembly, to take up this challenge, to move from a position of no or later to a position of yes and now. Excellencies, as we embark on our discussion, I urge you to think about those who rely on you and your ability to agree, to ensure their safety and well-being, to guarantee the delivery of humanitarian aid that will save their lives, to support inclusive peace processes with full, equal, and meaningful participation of women and marginalized groups that will end the fighting and suffering in their communities, to support the demobilization of former combatants and child soldiers that will reunite their families, and to ensure protection from conflict-related sexual violence that no one should ever have to endure. There is nothing more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things, as the adage goes. For us today, I would add, there is nothing more necessary. Deadlock translates to a dead end for the millions of children, women, men, and families who are all suffering the consequences. They are putting their trust in us to step beyond power dynamics. I'm imploring you to respond by prioritizing dialogue and diplomacy, to trade your political differences for genuine political will to find solutions, to go beyond the calculations of distrust and old rivalries, to focus on what unites us all. Together with my office, I stand ready to support member states in that, in any way possible. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Qureshi, for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the External Affairs Minister of India. Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, thank you all for joining us at today's open debate of the Council on a topic of growing relevance. I particularly appreciate the presence of the UN Secretary General and the President of the 77th UN General Assembly. This is a reflection of the importance of the subject at hand. Excellencies, we have convened here today for an honest conversation about the effectiveness of multilateral institutions created more than 75 years ago. The question before us is how best they can be reformed, particularly as the need to reform is less deniable with each passing year. This debate and its outcome will not only help determine what kind of United Nations we wish to see, but also what kind of global order that best reflects contemporary realities. The need for a new orientation for a reformed multilateral system, or norms, as we titled it, flows from this widespread recognition. While the matter concerns the fullest constituency of member states, the Security Council too has an important stake in the consideration of this crucial question, because at the end of the day, it has direct implications for maintaining international peace and security. And it is in the fitness of things that such a discussion takes place as an open debate. All of us are aware that the question of equitable representation on and increase in the membership of the Security Council has been on the UNGA agenda for well over 3 decades. While the debate on reforms has meandered aimlessly, the real world, meanwhile, has changed dramatically. We see that in terms of economic prosperity, technology capabilities, political influence, and developmental progress. The broad dispersal of capabilities and responsibilities has been expressed, for example, in the emergence of the G20. That realization is now steadily percolating through the wider membership of the UN. At the 77th UNGA, we were all witness to a growing sentiment in favor of reform. Our challenge is to translate that into concrete outcomes. The call for change has been accelerated by growing stresses on the international system that we have experienced in recent years. On the one hand, they have brought out the inequities and the inadequacies of the way the world currently functions. On the other, they have also highlighted that a larger and deeper collaboration is necessary to find solutions. Let me give a few examples. During the COVID pandemic, many vulnerable nations of the global south got their first vaccines from beyond their traditional sources. Indeed, the diversification of the global production was itself a recognition of how much the old order had changed. The knock-on effects of conflict situations have also underscored the necessity for a more broad-based global governance. Recent concerns over food, fertilizer, and fuel security were not adequately articulated in the highest councils of decision-making. Much of the world was therefore led to believe that their interests did not matter. We cannot let that happen again. When it comes to climate action and climate justice, the state of affairs is no better. Instead of addressing the relevant issues in the appropriate forum, we have seen attempts at distraction and diversion. On the challenge of terrorism, even as the world is coming together with a more collective response, multilateral platforms are being misused to justify and protect perpetrators. Each one of these examples makes a strong case why it should not be business as usual in the multilateral domain. We not only need to increase stakeholdership, but also enhance the effectiveness and credibility of multilateralism in the eyes of the international community and in the eyes of global public opinion. That is the purpose of NOBS. Excellencies, if this is to happen, member states from Latin America, Africa, Asia, and small island developing states should have credible and continuing representation in the Security Council. Decisions about the future can no longer be taken without their participation. Equally important is to make working methods and processes of the global institutions, including this Council, more accountable, objective, and transparent. Failing to do so would only lend this Council to charges of politicization. Excellencies, let us recall that at every milestone in multilateral diplomacy, the sentiment for reform has been expressed at the highest levels. This ranges from the Millennium Declaration to the World Summit of 2005 and the 75th Anniversary Declaration of the UN in 2020. This year, too, the UNGA heard calls from more than 70 leaders, more than double the number of 2021. Why then are we failing to deliver on such a strong desire for change? The answer lies in the nature of the IGN process itself. One, it is the only one in the United Nations that is conducted without any time frame. Two, it is also singular in being negotiated without any text. And three, there is no record keeping that allows progress to be recognized and carried forward. Not just that, there are actually suggestions that negotiations start only when consensus has been achieved. Surely, we cannot have a more extreme case of putting the cart before the horse. 3 decades since the formation of the open-ended working group on UNSC reforms, we have nothing to show for precisely these reasons. This is creating an intense sense of frustration among the wider membership. Attempts to propose piecemeal changes will not be accepted by them as an alternative. Excellencies, the UN Secretary General has rightly called for, I quote, transforming this moment of crisis into a moment of multilateralism, unquote. But that moment must capture this sense of change and not remain a prisoner of the past. After all, our common agenda and the summit of the future will only deliver results if they respond to the growing calls for reform multilateralism. Reform is the need of the day, and I am confident that the Global South especially shares India's determination to persevere. I thank you, and I now resume my duties as a chair. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Noura bint Mohammed Al-Kabi, Cabinet Member and Minister of Culture and Youth of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank India for organizing this open debate, and I am grateful to the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, and the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Shaba Qureshi, for their briefings. Allow me to also congratulate you and the Indian mission on a very successful 8th term on the Security Council. Your voice in this chamber is necessary, and the United Arab Emirates reiterates its endorsement of India's bid for permanent membership of a reformed Security Council. Mr. President, since 1945, multilateral system anchored in the United Nations and based on international law has evolved into a large and complex architecture To multilateralism's great credit, our institutions and responses have adapted and expanded over time to address humanity's emerging needs. Yet, any survey of the global landscape reveals the widening gap between the aspirations of multilateralism and contemporary reality. To begin addressing the disconnect, reform must adapt the multilateral system to three fundamental dynamics. First, the global South is severely disadvantaged in multilateral governance. That is particularly stark here in the most consensual UN organ for maintaining international peace and security. The Security Council structure is not reflective of geopolitical reality or the international community's diversity. As a result, the Arab world and Africa, the regions with the most at stake in the Council's agenda, are still disenfranchised in both categories of membership. The same applies to the Bretton Woods institutions, where an outdated formula to determine voting shares preserve a deeply unrepresentative governance structure, creating a situation where the developing world's two largest economies are profoundly underrepresented. Second, rising geopolitical tensions threaten cooperation on pressing global challenges. Inherent in the founding vision of the Council is a notion that pervades the entire multilateral system. Regular interaction, and for the major powers, a privileged position, would incentivize peaceful and sustained international cooperation. However, escalating polarization is increasingly disrupting critical multilateral process. Here in the Council, for example, consensus is becoming more difficult around issues that usually produce unanimity, such as vital mandate renewals for peace operations. Likewise, coordination within international financial institutions is suffering, including with regards to multilateral action on the on the $2.5 trillion debt crisis looming over the global South. Third, middle powers, developing countries, and smaller states are increasingly stepping up to ensure continued multilateral dialogue and progress. That was evident in the G20 summit in Bali, Turkey's work with the Secretary General on the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and at the COP27 in Egypt, particularly with the historic inclusion of loss and damage as an agenda item. Similarly, in recent years, elected members of this body have assumed greater responsibility for drafting and negotiating outcomes documents that has helped break deadlock and produced more inclusive and responsive text and some landmark council decisions. As the UAE minister responsible for our efforts on the protection of cultural heritage and conflict, I am especially grateful to Italy for its partnership with France on Resolution 2347. Mr. President, the multilateral system is an extraordinary achievement. When the Nobel Committee awarded Kofi Annan and the UN the Peace Prize in 2001, it explained the delay by confessing the UN could have won the award so often that in the end it never did. In many parts of the world, it has restored peace, rebuilt societies, eradicated disease, and fought hunger. That is only part of what we lose by not committing to meaningful change. Invariably, the starting point for reform is equitable representation in decision-making and norm-setting, but it is just a starting point. Beyond that, multilateralism must adapt to a world where non-state actors influence global processes. Climate change, the pandemic, food insecurity, and the debt crisis all underscore the need for more public-private partnership. Likewise, civil society organizations reinforce multilateral action around the world with vital work, for example, in the Mosul, where the UAE is partnering with UNESCO to restore cultural heritage. I witnessed firsthand just how dependent reconciliation and peace building are on civil society. Mr. President, reforming multilateralism will not be easy. Concrete outcomes will require us all to make concessions and agree to compromise. whether at the intergovernmental negotiations or the general review of codes. But like all of us here, we have heard the growing calls for reform and recognize that resisting them means running on borrowed time. We also know that the UN and arguably the entire multilateral system came out of one of the bleakest periods in human history. Today, the world faces what the Secretary General called our biggest shared test since the Second World War. We must heed his warning with the determined ingenuity that in humanity's hallmark and work collectively to ensure that multilateralism is fit for purpose in the 21st century. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Al-Kabi, for her statement. I give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United Nations and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Good. Thank you very much, Minister Jaishankar, and thank you for choosing to focus on the future of multilateralism and the importance of UN reform during your presidency. I'd like to welcome you here in India's last month on the Council and congratulate India for a successful 2-year tenure on the Council. And thank you, Secretary General, for your briefing, and President Qureshi for your briefing and efforts to advance a UN that is flexible and that is fit for purpose. What does it mean for a 77-year-old institution to be fit for purpose? What is ultimately the purpose of the United Nations? In 1945, when delegates from around the world met in San Francisco, President Truman outlined that purpose in his opening remarks. This conference, he said, will devote its energies and its labors exclusively to the single problem of setting up the essential organization to keep the peace. To keep the peace. That was our original purpose. Of course, we've not always succeeded. Wars have still started, including one by a permanent member of the Security Council this past year. Deadlock has often prevented progress. Human suffering has persisted. But at the same time, we have also seen enormous success in realizing the original vision of the UN Charter, a vision that expanded beyond maintaining peace and security to include human rights, the rule of law, and development. Together, we have curtailed nuclear proliferation. Together, we have adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Together, we sent UN peacekeepers to stop mass atrocities, and we forged truces and permanent peace agreements through negotiation and mediation. Together, we have lifted over 1 billion people out of poverty and provided humanitarian aid on a scale that no single country could contribute alone. These are remarkable accomplishments, but with the state of the world today, they cannot leave us satisfied. We have to contain climate change, eliminate the COVID-19 pandemic, and end the global hunger crisis. We have to defend human rights, improve humanitarian efforts, address persistent pandemics, prevent the next pandemic, and most important of all, defend the UN Charter and hold those who seek to undermine it accountable. To do this, the United States believes we can and must advance an affirmative agenda for the future of the United Nations. Our hope is to build consensus around a future we collectively seek, a future where we all uphold the UN Charter, a future where we solve the consequential global challenges of our time, like food security, global health threats, extreme poverty, sustainable development, and conflict mediation. A future where we safeguard our shared interconnected resources. A future where we champion universal respect for human rights. To see this future, we need to strengthen the United Nations. So the United States is pursuing a UN modernization agenda consistent with this vision, one that includes Security Council reform. That is why, during a visit to the UN's birthplace in San Francisco, I laid out our 6 clear principles of responsible behavior for Security Council members, including our commitment to refrain from the use of the veto except in rare and extraordinary circumstances. These are standards we're setting for ourselves and what we welcome all of you to hold us to. It's why we were proud to co-sponsor an initiative by a group of forward-leaning countries, spearheaded by Liechtenstein, that requires the General Assembly to convene a meeting after any veto has been cast. And it is why at this year's General Assembly, President Biden announced that the United States supports Security Council expansion in both permanent and non-permanent categories, including permanent membership for Africa and for Latin America and the Caribbean. The Security Council should reflect our global realities today, not the global realities of 77 years ago. But given how difficult Security Council reform will be to reach, we must be flexible in our approach to change. As President Kuroshi said during last month's General Assembly debate on this topic, Security Council reform can only be achieved if major groups and member states are willing to make compromises from their long-held positions. As you know, I have begun a series of wide-ranging consultations with member states, regional blocs, and reform groups to discuss both expansion proposals and other ways to make the Council more effective, transparent, and inclusive. We're open to creative ideas and to credible, sensible, and politically viable paths forward. This is a listening tour to hear ideas from all members, as it is critical that everyone sees himself in the process. I'm looking forward to continuing these engagements, including through the intergovernmental negotiation process. I'm thankful to the incoming IGN co-chairs Kuwait and Slovakia for answering the collective UN membership's call for change, and I look forward to working together in the months ahead. Of course, the United Nations is not the only Security Council, the United Nations is not only the Security Council, far from it. And just as the Council needs to be updated for our modern era, so too must we reform and reinvigorate the UN system more broadly. We need to develop a more robust and responsive global health security architecture to prevent and respond to future pandemics. We need to make the UN development system more coherent and accountable. We need to make the UN humanitarian system more responsive, effective, and efficient to meet the extraordinary humanitarian needs brought on by conflict, displacement, migration, and a rapidly changing climate. The Secretary General's initiative, Our Common Agenda, is a welcome vehicle for this conversation. Thank you, Secretary General. We believe it can serve as a foundation for this important discussion and the work ahead. This next year, let us commit to doing this work. Let us build a new consensus, one that would propel us toward the Secretary General's Summit for the Future, with both a renewed commitment to the Charter and a shared vision for a stronger UN system. Let us build a United Nations for our children and their children, for them to be proud of, one that fosters a more peaceful, more open, more prosperous world for us all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ramesses Cleland, Permanent Secretary of Ghana.
Mr. President, Minister of External Affairs of India, I begin by congratulating you and the delegation of India on your presidency of the Security Council for the month of December. We welcome the focus of today's open debate and support its intention to reinforce discussions on the kind of orientation required to realize the much-anticipated reform of the multilateral system. We thank the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, for the depth and clarity of his statement, as well as His Excellency Shaba Kirosi, President of the General Assembly, for his insightful remarks. Mr. President, 77 years ago, the founding fathers of the United Nations bequeathed to us a multilateral system which was designed to ensure global peace and stability. This system was anchored on the absolute prohibition of the unjustified use of force, as well as the search to realize the aspirations of a more interdependent world. When we look across history, we see over the years the coordinated efforts that have been made for the maintenance of international peace and security, the promotion of international rule of law, and the prevention of a calamitous world war. We can only conclude that the founders were right in their ambitions and largely justified in their tireless efforts in San Francisco. However, we are also not oblivious to the fact that the nature and frequency of global crises in the post-1945 era have evolved. Today, we are witnesses to complex, interacting, and reinforcing crises that range from sharp geopolitical differences, the escalated risk of nuclear weapons, increasing asymmetrical and transnational conflicts, widespread and systematic violation of human rights, debilitating pandemics, and the adverse effect of climate change on food systems, livelihoods, and the general management of societies. The challenges of the present era underpin the need for comprehensive and integrated reform of all the pillars of the multilateral system, especially the peace and security architecture, as well as the development and financial systems. We will indeed be remiss if we should lose sight of the fact that inadequacies in one pillar will certainly have consequences for the overall effective functioning of the multilateral system. Mr. President, while reforms in themselves are not an end in themselves, they are often necessary catalysts for calibrating a better approach to collectively realize the objectives we seek. It is therefore not surprising that over the 3 decades of frustrating discussions on the reform of the United Nations Security Council, there have been several calls for global solidarity to ensure an early reform of this noble institution. The most notable recent call was that made by our heads of state and governments in the 75th anniversary political declaration for us to instill new life into the reform process of the Security Council under the aegis of the intergovernmental negotiations process. In recalling the convergence of this global aspiration, we also reiterate the call by President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo to this council a few weeks ago on the need, I quote, to revisit the vexed issue of the reform of the United Nations system, especially the Security Council, and to do so on the basis of the African Common Position on UN reform as enunciated in the Azowini Consensus. If indeed the authority of this council, which in recent times appears to have been devalued because of its anachronistic structure, is to be restored. End of quotes. Ghana believes that the conversations around the reform of the Security Council must necessarily be underpinned by the imperatives of Africa's arguments, which is the only continent without a permanent membership of this council. The historical injustice to the 54 member states of Africa, with a population of more than 1.3 billion and a combined economy in excess of $3.5 trillion must be prioritized. Africa, like all those that hold permanent membership of this council, while even under colonial domination, played a veritable role in the successful end of the Second World War in resources and the several lives sacrificed. We are encouraged by the positive statements by several world leaders at the recent high-level week of the General Assembly and urge that the process of reform must yield real changes to the structure and practices of the Council across the 5 clusters of reform under discussion in the IGN process in an effort to make it innovative in its approach. We also welcome the Secretary General's report on our common agenda, including a new agenda for peace. And we believe a good faith engagement by member states on these proposals could help bring about a new orientation in the nation focus of the peace architecture. It is important that a reformed Security Council aspires to operate differently, and we must avoid putting old wine in new wineskins and vice versa. Mr. President, there were many assumptions underpinning the multilateral system, which today do not hold. In seeking new orientations for a reformed multilateralism, therefore, we should be cognizant of the assumptions we establish as basis for reforms. In this regard, we need to acknowledge that the challenges of today are beyond the reach of any few powerful countries to resolve. It requires a shared responsibility and a common understanding for their resolution. We therefore believe that the General Assembly, which is the most representative organ of the UN, should be made to find new space in the reform agenda, and regional arrangements which were envisaged under Chapter 8 of the Charter as effective collaborators of the collective security mechanism would need to be worked with more closely than ever before. For instance, we cannot attempt any legitimate resolution of terrorism on the African continent without the collaboration of institutions of the African Union and regional economic communities such as ECOWAS. Also, emerging threats and a clarified understanding of the impact of other crises on peace and security imply that a reformed multilateralism would need to embrace an integrated approach to peace and security that accommodates the linkages from climate change, global public health emergencies, and financial meltdowns. Furthermore, a renewed multilateral system should take into consideration several of the international developmental institutions and processes outside the UN, including the Bretton Woods institutions that are failing to adequately respond to the pressing needs of the peoples of the world, especially those of the developing world. When there is a global financial and food crisis, as we are presently experiencing, it should be expected that further down the road, there would be greater manifestations of socio-political instability, diminished capacity for conflict management, and further conflicts. Mr. President, in concluding, therefore, Ghana believes that a holistic renewal of multilateralism characterized by the inclusion of new concepts across the pillars of the work of the United Nations is necessary to get us much closer to having multilateralism work for all and not only for a few. Time is not on our side, and we need to act now. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cleland, for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Your Excellency, Minister Jaishankar, President of the Security Council, distinguished President of the General Assembly, Secretary General, Ministers, Excellencies, colleagues. I would like to start by commending India for organizing this very timely high-level debate, and the President of the General Assembly and the Secretary General for their instigating remarks. Mr. President, Minister Carlos França has asked me to convey to you his deep regrets at not being present at this debate, as was his intention, for Brazil attaches the highest importance to our subject matter today. Mr. President, the post-war global governance structure was created in an entirely different international context than that which we face today. Equally challenging and complex, but very, very distinct. The crises we have been facing and may yet face in the not-too-distant future, whether related to health, climate, economic and trade issues, or peace and security, have clearly demonstrated that the world has changed at a much faster pace than multilaterally agreed norms and rules, as well as the governance structures of multilateral institutions responsible for negotiating solutions and setting these rules. As a result, the international community remains unable to provide timely and effective coordinated solutions to old and new challenges that affect us. So much so that we begin to lose the confidence of our peoples, and indeed, the entire fabric of multilateralism seems to be unraveling. There seems to be widespread agreement that we are facing crises on multiple fronts, and that the consensus, and yet the consensus that none of these issues can be truly overcome by one nation or even in small groups, lives side by side with the slow but steady fragmentation of the multilateral order and growing lack of credibility of the post-war international regimes. The development gap between nations needs to be at the center stage of international governance if we want to address the root causes of many of the interconnected problems the world faces today. Discussions in the Security Council clearly show that poverty and inequality within and between nations are intrinsically linked to conflicts. In this regard, we could devote more time to discussing the linkages between poverty, inequality, and conflict on an equal footing with other emerging challenges that have captured the Council's attention in the last years. The conflict in Ukraine reignited old disputes and brought the world once again to the brink of a disaster. The deadlock in the Security Council and the spillover effect that the conflict had in other multilateral forums, some of them unrelated to the situation itself, played a destabilizing effect over the institutions we rely on to uphold the principles we share. More than that, the conflict in Ukraine exacerbated long-known shortcomings and unveiled the consequences of our inability to adapt old institutions to new realities. Since World War II, many new issues and threats have emerged, and the multilateral system has created tools to address them. If the main international organizations in the economic domain, such as the IMF and the World Bank, were able to initiate a reform process to update their composition and working methods, we would expect the same from the main world political body. It is shocking that entire regions are excluded from the Security Council's central decision-making processes, with the complete absence of Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean among permanent members. Although reform is needed on many fronts, peace and security is an area of particular concern. This is where reform talks are completely stalled, despite the blatant inadequacy of the current structure of the United Nations Security Council. Excuse me. While world governance has become increasingly more complex and challenges more serious, the reform of the Security Council has become only more urgent and essential to make the body more representative, legitimate, and effective. Sadly, we have already started to bear the consequences of our inaction. An instrument designed according to the interests of 20th century powers to solve 20th century problems, the Security Council is no longer fit for purpose. It is proving unable to uphold international law and defend the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. Above all, it no longer spurs peaceful resolution of conflicts, as well as diplomacy and dialogue. As a consequence, we are now regretfully confronted with a political crisis without the tools in place to remediate it in a legitimate and effective manner. The world outside these halls is taking note of this. We are glad, however, that the vast majority of the membership agrees on the need to act swiftly. The urgency of reform was clearly acknowledged by many of our leaders in the general debate last September, including developing and developed countries from all regions of the globe and most of the permanent members of this Council. Mr. President, turning to the main elements of reform, there are 2 points I would like to stress. First, the deadlock that emerged in the Council in the context of the conflict in Ukraine increased the support for initiatives aimed at curtailing and regulating the veto power. Brazil agrees with the general intention behind most of them, such as the French-Mexican initiative on veto restraint to the case of mass atrocities. The veto, however, is rather an expression of the great divide that stalls the Council than the main reason why the organ has become ineffective. A veto is cast only after diplomacy and dialogue have not prospered. This brings me to my second point. The composition of the Security Council remains the central and most important issue of the reform. The Security Council cannot and will not be a legitimate and effective body as long as the Global South remains sidelined and whole regions, such as Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa, are not represented in the permanent category. We need to pave the way for the inclusion in the Council of new members capable of taking on major responsibilities in the field of international peace and security, representing all regions of the world. For effective diplomacy, the Security Council needs to be fully attuned to today's reality. Furthermore, it is imperative that the lack of representativeness of the Council be addressed in the reform in both categories of membership. A half-hearted reform that does not address the fundamental problem of lack of representation and, by consequence, lack of legitimacy in the permanent category will be merely window dressing. Besides the composition itself, it is imperative to make progress in the discussions related to the Council's working methods with a view to bringing more transparency and accountability to its activities. The Security Council must be more open in relation to non-member states, more efficient in its decision-making process, and seek greater coordination with other UN bodies, especially the Peacebuilding Commission. Mr. President, the international system is at a critical juncture, facing a multifaceted crisis, while its central body in the field of peace and security seems unequipped to provide us with answers and solutions. The Council should be much more than a forum for mutual accusations or a stage to entertain a specific audience. Reform is needed so that the Council becomes once again a forum for constant dialogue and diplomacy, an organ where mutually agreed compromises are found and tensions subside. We take this opportunity to express our disappointment with the fact that Security Council reform is not mentioned in the proposals concerning a new agenda for peace proposed in the report Our Common Agenda. Brazil firmly believes that any agenda for peace that does not include the UN Security Council reform cannot be considered new. The formulation of a new agenda for peace must include a profound discussion on how to relaunch the discussions beyond the IGN format, which has run its course. Let us finally go for the high-hanging fruit. After almost a decade in which some delegations effectively took the reform process hostage, we need to untangle ourselves, galvanize member states to negotiate in good faith and act with a sense of urgency. Too much is at risk, and therefore we all need to rise to the occasion. In the current circumstance, more of the same has become irresponsible at best. If we fail to advance reform in a timely fashion, the entire multilateral architecture constructed at the end of World War II will be in peril. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Your Excellency, and I thank the Indian Presidency for organising this very important open debate. I also thank the Secretary-General and the President of the General Assembly for their briefings today and for their participation. Mr. President, just last week we marked the 100th anniversary of an independent Irish state. One of its first acts was to seek membership of the League of Nations. Ever since, Ireland has remained steadfast in its commitment to multilateralism, and we believe it remains essential to address the global challenges of today. To sit at this table with the mandate of election by the General Assembly is both a great honour and a great privilege. And those of us lucky enough to do so should be frank enough honest enough to admit that today multilateralism is struggling. Here in this chamber, charged with the critical mandate to maintain international peace and security, too often we are unable to rise to that challenge. During the last 2 years of our term, we have seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine in clear violation of the UN Charter, a vetoed climate and security resolution, continued resistance to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and no progress on realising a two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, despite monthly discussions on this issue. There is therefore much room for improvement. Madam President, I would like to make 3 points. My first is that multilateral institutions and the rules and norms that underpin them must evolve to face the realities of today. Reform is never easy, but where there is political will, we have seen that it is achievable. In April, we were pleased to be part of the core group of states led by Liechtenstein, which brought the veto initiative to the General Assembly. The adoption of that resolution was a significant step towards increased scrutiny of veto use and indeed of this Council. Last month in Dublin, the political declaration on strengthening the protection of civilians from the humanitarian consequences arising from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, known as EWIPA, was adopted by 83 states. The declaration is an important new instrument that will help to protect civilians from explosive weapons. And just last week, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2664, which will help to ensure that humanitarians can continue their vital work without fear of inadvertently falling foul of UN sanctions regimes. There are many other examples, but the lesson for this Council is clear. When we cooperate, when we act in good faith, progress is possible, reform is possible, and new norms can be established. Secondly, the Security Council itself is long overdue reform. This Council, as other speakers have said, simply does not reflect the world of today. Ireland has worked in close partnership with our African colleagues and our African partners on the Security Council. The historic and unjust underrepresentation of Africa on this Council must be addressed. Those that are most often the subject of Security Council discussions must have a meaningful representative say at this table. But a more representative Council will not be enough. We must also change how the Council takes decisions. Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine is an affront to the principles on which this organisation was built. It is a violation of international law and the UN Charter, the very foundations of multilateralism. But as in so many other cases, the Security Council has been unable to respond to this outrage due to the use or threat of the veto. This cannot continue. The veto is an anachronism. It prevents the Security Council from implementing its mandate. It allows aggressors to evade accountability. The urgent calls for Security Council reform grow ever louder. They must not go unanswered. History will not judge us kindly if we allow this moment to pass. At a very minimum, all members of this Council, elected and permanent, should agree to refrain from blocking any draft resolution intended to prevent or stop mass atrocities. Finally, Madam President, the Secretary-General's Our Common Agenda offers a path forward. Ireland will play an active role in its implementation. We look forward to working with partners on the new agenda for peace. And we also look forward to supporting efforts to get back on track towards sustainable development, notably by co-facilitating negotiations for the outcome of the SDG Summit next September. Ultimately, however, reforms alone will not make multilateralism work. The responsibility rests with us, the Member States. Ireland will finish its term on the Security Council at the end of this month. Over the past 2 years, we have seen how an absence of trust has prevented the Council from effectively implementing its mandate. If Council members, and the permanent members in particular, deeply distrust each other, this body cannot hope to meet the immense challenges it faces. Member States will continue to have differing perspectives on many of the issues on the Council agenda, but all Council members, permanent and elected, must find a way to work in genuine partnership and in good faith, so that the Council can act with the ambition and determination that are required of it today, and that the world calls on it to act today. Too often we have seen narrow self-interest take precedence in this Council, and we have seen Council members block crucial decisions to protect themselves or their allies. Madam President, Council members, whether permanent or elected, have reached this table in different ways. But once we are in this chamber, we have a shared and collective responsibility to defend international peace and security. We must live up to that responsibility, not abdicate it. Thank you.
I thank Ireland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking the Secretary-General and the President of the General Assembly for opening our debate and their leadership on this issue. The UK has long supported multilateralism, and we remain deeply committed to it today. We take seriously our role in strengthening the multilateral system and supporting the rules-based international order. This is more important than ever. Today, as we've heard, we face extraordinary, complex, and interconnected challenges. This includes the global threat posed by climate change and violations of human rights that have a disproportionate effect on women and girls. With Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, we've also witnessed a permanent member of the Security Council violating the UN Charter and flouting the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. In the face of these challenges, the UN as a whole and the Security Council must continue to take decisive action. But the world today is very different to the one that gave birth to the UN in 1945. So it's right that we consider how the UN and the multilateral system should evolve. The Security Council must, as others have said, become more representative of the world today. And the UK has long called for its expansion in both the permanent and non-permanent categories. As the UK Foreign Secretary publicly reiterated this week, we support new permanent seats for Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, and permanent African representation. We also look forward to the resumption of the General Assembly's intergovernmental negotiations on Security Council reform and hope to see these progress to a text in the new year. Beyond the Security Council, the UK welcomes the Secretary-General's efforts to advance wider UN reform. We strongly support his reform agenda and vision for a UN 2.0, better adapted to the challenges of the 21st century. We also welcome the Secretary-General's report on our common agenda, seeking to turbocharge delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. As we know, these have been set back by the pandemic and the global energy and food crises. The new agenda for peace, in particular, will set new ambition for the UN's response to international peace and security, and we welcome the further detail the Secretary-General set out today. Through better data use, analysis, innovation, and strategic foresight, we can unlock the full potential of the UN. This must also be accompanied by a focus on results. Beyond this, we support reform efforts with international financial institutions and admire the momentum built by the Prime Minister of Barbados, Her Excellency Mia Mottley. The UK is driving forward many of the objectives of the Bridgetown Agenda, including on greater finance provision, the G20's Capital Adequacy Framework Review, and on climate change financing. In closing, Madam President, I quote from the Foreign Secretary's speech this week: "We all benefit from the wisdom and compassion of those leaders who created the laws and institutions that prevent a relapse to the old order where the strong prey on the weak." So in conclusion, Madam President, we will continue working with our partners to ensure that the UN and the multilateral system as a whole is best positioned to respond to the complex challenges of today's world. And I thank you for convening today's debate.
I thank the Ambassador of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, thank you for organizing this debate. I would like to welcome the participation of the Secretary-General and the President of the General Assembly. The international multilateral order is currently being undermined by those who support the idea that might makes right. The idea that an international system based on rules is the best way to guarantee our security and our prosperity is no longer obvious to everyone. The challenges that the international system faces, nevertheless, require collective responses. That's the case for economic and development issues, health, or indeed when it comes to the fight against climate change. France is deeply committed to a multilateralism that is based on international law in all of its dimensions, including human rights and humanitarian law. This is the best response to these common challenges. The reform of multilateralism, of course, also involves revitalizing the General Assembly, paying constant attention to multilingualism, and being wary when it comes to the risks of disinformation and the attitude that some states have to the maintenance of peace. In this context, the Security Council remains the cornerstone of our collective security architecture. I would like to restate firmly that France is in favor of a reform of the Security Council, as was restated by President Macron at the General Assembly. We support an expansion of the Security Council to take into account the emergence of new powers that have the will and the ability to shoulder the responsibility of a permanent presence on the Security Council. France thus supports the candidacies of Germany, Brazil, India, and Japan as permanent members. We also wish to see greater presence from African countries among the permanent members and among the non-permanent members. An expanded council could include as many as 25 members, which would make it more representative of today's world, while at the same time preserving its executive and operational nature. France calls for the new cycle of intergovernmental negotiations to lead to concrete and substantial results. This would mean us now moving forward on the basis of a text. While a permanent member of the Security Council is waging a war of annexation in violation of the United Nations Charter, many of us have called for a limiting of the veto in order to strengthen the ability of the Security Council to fully shoulder its responsibilities. It is with this in mind that France and Mexico from 2013 have been proposing that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council voluntarily and collectively suspend the use of the veto in the case of mass atrocities. This voluntary action would not require a revision of the Charter, but simply a political commitment from the permanent members. We call on all member states to support this initiative, which has already received the support of 106 member states. Madam President, allow me to conclude by quoting what Emmanuel Macron, the President, said before the General Assembly of the United Nations. Multilateralism means the rule of law, exchange among peoples, the equality of each and every one of us, and that is what allows us to build peace and to overcome each of our challenges. Thank you.
France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President,
The world today is undergoing major changes unseen in a century, and the world economy, international security, geopolitics, energy, environment, and global governance are all facing daunting challenges. The international system with the UN at its core is both carrying higher expectations and facing unprecedented pressure. How can multilateral mechanisms better tackle threats and challenges? And what direction should multilateralism take? These are questions on the minds of all those who care about the well-being and the future of the humanity. The essence of multilateralism is that international affairs are handled jointly by all, through consultation, and the future and destiny of the world jointly held by all countries. First of all, we must see that the world is facing various challenges today. Not because the purposes and principles of the UN Charter have become obsolete, but precisely because they have not been effectively implemented. Not because multilateralism itself has gone wrong, but precisely because the essence of multilateralism has not been truly practiced. True multilateralism means the world is one family, and humanity has shared destiny. All countries should strengthen their unity under the UN banner to achieve common development, safeguard common security, and build a shared future. Seeking artificial decoupling is neither desirable nor feasible. Drawing lines based on ideology and forming camps and exclusive small circles targeting at certain countries run counter to the spirit of multilateralism and will only push the world toward division and confrontation. True multilateralism means maintaining the international system with the UN at its core, safeguarding the international order based on international law, and defending the basic norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. International rules should be based on international law and formulated by all, rather than unilaterally developed by a few and imposed upon the international community. Not to mention exceptionalism and double standards. The so-called rule-based international order is ambiguous and does not represent the common will of the international community. True multilateralism means acting together to achieve win-win cooperation. The UN should proceed from the common challenges and give priority to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, so as to ensure that all countries, in particular developing countries, benefit fairly from multilateral cooperation. The UN should be a platform for dialogue and cooperation, and no country should base its policy toward the UN on strategic gaming or unilaterally seek monopoly at the cost of other countries' interests. China has always firmly upheld and practiced multilateralism during its presidency of the Council last May. China proposed convening a high-level council meeting on safeguarding multilateralism and the international system with the UN at its core to promote the reaffirmation of all parties' commitment to multilateralism and to build consensus on the use of multilateralism to tackle pressing global problems and to ensure a greater role of the UN and the Security Council in international affairs. Not long ago, when meeting with Secretary General Guterres, President Xi Jinping highlighted that China would continue to uphold genuine multilateralism and firmly support the work of the UN. Madam President, The Security Council is at the core of the UN collective security system and an important platform for translating the ideas of multilateralism into actions. Under the current situation, it is shared expectation of the general membership for the Council to better perform its mandate entrusted to it by the UN Charter. In this connection, China would like to share a few observations. First, to improve the unity and cooperation of the Council. No matter how big the differences are, Council members should respect each other, adhere to dialogue and consultations, accommodate each other's concerns to the greatest extent possible, and avoid stoking division and confrontation. No matter how complicated the challenges are, it is always our greatest responsibility to stay united and work together to maintain international peace and security. Second, to adhere to political settlement of disputes. Pushing the Council to invoke Chapter 7 of the Charter or resorting to sanctions and other coercive measures are often not as effective as they should be. More efforts should be made in negotiation, good offices, and mediation, and the role of regional organizations in conflict prevention and resolution should be fully leveraged. The existing sanctions should also be reviewed, updated, or lifted in a timely manner in light of the development on the ground. Third, to focus on resolving the root causes of problems. The Council should not only be satisfied with daily crisis management, but also take comprehensive measures based on the causes of hotspot issues to help countries concerned improve governance, achieve sustainable economic and social development, and fundamentally eliminate the breeding ground for conflicts by promoting employment and improving people's livelihood, so as to promote peace through development. Fourth, to keep improving the Council's working methods. The most pressing need here is to systematically adjust the penholder system and to change the unjust and unreasonable situation that for long a few permanent members of the Council or political blocs are the penholders of most agenda items. Through the creation of co-penholders, jointly held and regularly rotated among permanent and non-permanent members, among others, the voice of small and medium-sized countries should be enhanced regarding the agenda of the Council. Madam President, the problems in the Council epitomize the systematic flaws of global governance. It is imperative to comprehensively advance reforms of global political, security, economic, financial, and trade governance, enhance the representation and voice of developing countries in global affairs, and promote the development of a more just and equitable global governance architecture. China supports reasonable and necessary reforms of the Council, with priority given to increase the membership of developing and independent countries, including small and medium-sized countries, thereby completely correcting the imbalance of its composition. Africa's unique demand for redressing historical injustice should be fully respected, and special arrangements should be made to comprehensively address Africa's concerns and effectively enhance its representation and voice. The General Assembly has mandated the establishment of an IGN mechanism on Security Council reform, which is the only legitimate channel for all member states to conduct equal consultation and in-depth discussion on Council's reform. The Council should not encroach on the mandate of the GA or interfere with the work of the IGN. Member states should continue to conduct in-depth discussions on various reform ideas and proposals in the IGN in order to seek a package solution that accommodates the interests and concerns of all parties and to reach the broadest political consensus so as to ensure that the reform brings about progress rather than regression, upholds the interests of the broad membership rather than that of just a few countries, and strengthens rather than weakens the role of the Security Council. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Ambassador of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Kenya.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and I thank His Excellency Dr. Jai Shankar for convening this important debate. I congratulate India for ably steering this year's final presidency and the sustained excellence of your delegation's diplomatic efforts in the last 2 years. We have both been non-permanent members of the Council. I also thank the Secretary General and the President of the General Assembly for their contributions to this debate. Madam President, as your concept note for this meeting makes clear, the need for reforms of the UN, including the Security Council, has been repeatedly embraced by our leaders. In declaration after declaration, they have stated their commitment to changes that enable multilateralism to be fit to meet the most urgent challenges. Regrettably, these changes have not been forthcoming. There are many different reasons for our lethargy and even resistance to change. But most important among them is the defense of the present global balance of power as reflected in our institutional arrangements. And that balance, or rather imbalance, between states and peoples is often the very cause or an important driver of the challenges that we need to solve. From climate change to the inequities and inequalities of the global financial and trading system, and to the abuse of military might contrary to international law, we are witness to the impunity of those who with more power over those with a deficit of it. We can also agree that there are serious deficits in the balance of responsibilities and in the balance of consequences. For the former, those charged with the most responsibility and given commensurate power in the multilateral system are failing to discharge their duty individually and collectively. For the latter, as in the effects of climate change, those who do not cause the problem are often the ones who most suffer from it. These imbalances were built into the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions at the end of World War II, with those occupying the commanding heights given responsibility to the collective. Almost 8 decades after the founding of the UN, they sometimes tried to balance their worldwide interests and their responsibilities. But as the challenges grow, fed to no small extent by the pursuit of their gain, they are unable to solve them, and their appeals to collaboration ring hollow. Madam President, as a result of these imbalances, the world's confidence in our multilateral institutions is low and falling rapidly. In a visible manifestation of this unfortunate trend, we are witness to peacekeeping missions mandated by this Security Council facing heated popular protests against their perceived ineffectiveness in multiple countries. Compare this with the worldwide enthusiasm for the World Cup that's underway as we debate today. There is little doubt that this passion is fed by the perceived fairness of the rules. All teams must submit to the will of the referee, who is neutral. Despite our agonies at referee decisions against the teams we support, we ultimately respect the outcomes of the match. The United Nations needs to become a referee of equal stature to the men and women serving this function in Qatar. Madam President, the question now is what is to be done? To that end, I will make 4 proposals for the consideration of the membership. First is that we need a stronger referee as reflected in our regard for the Secretary General and the UN Secretariat. For all those who frequently praise a rules-based order, we urge a commensurate praise for a stronger referee. We refer you to Kenya's statement on the 26th of October this year during a discussion on the integrity of the UN Charter. As we did then, we urge adherence to Article 100, which protects the Secretary General and the staff from external influence or instruction, so that they can speak truth to power in defense of the letter and spirit of the Charter. The Secretary General must be fully partial to the Charter, and he should fully exercise Article 99 without regard for the approval or disapproval of any state or party. Without wanting to overdo the parallels with the World Cup, our second recommendation is that we strengthen our referee by changing how the senior ranks of UN funds, agencies, and specialized agencies are chosen. We can no longer have major institutions whose leadership is the exclusive preserve of a few member states. This practice saps confidence in these institutions by offending our sense of fair play, since many of their shortcomings, fairly or unfairly, are often laid at this door. Third is strengthening the links between the Security Council, other UN bodies, and regional arrangements. Strong regional mechanisms have increasingly played a key role in preventing escalation of conflicts and in their termination in the Security Council. We merit Africa's peace and security architecture and its deployment of multi-layered good offices, from the role of peers, the chairpersons of the Union and the Commission, the panel of the wise, and the regional economic communities. Kenya, as chair of the ad hoc working group on conflict prevention and resolution in Africa, has facilitated productive meetings between the Security Council and the African Union Peace and Security Council. These have produced important recommendations that need to now be implemented. Kenya's role for the last 2 years as the informal link between the Council and the Peace-Building Commission has strengthened our conviction about the immense potential good that can be realized by their cooperation. Change should start with the Council's openness to the latter's recommendations and complementary role. Fourth and finally, are substantive and procedural reforms of the Security Council. We welcome today's expressions of support for expanded membership of the Council and look forward to progress in realizing them. The changes must take into account Africa's historical exclusion and the extent of attention the Council pays to its conflicts. Colleagues, one extra seat among permanent members for Africa will not do. We fully align ourselves with Africa's Eswini Consensus and the CERT Declaration of 2005. And we want the membership to understand that Africa and other members in solidarity with it will insist on our position being met if reform is to move forward. Africa will no longer accept a junior position in global affairs. We will not accept skewed numbers. We will not accept imbalances when our security is at stake. Listening to the many fine ideas shared today, we are in particular agreement with Brazil's observation that the new agenda for peace must include Security Council reform if it is truly to offer a new chapter for multilateralism. For lack of time, I will finish by emphasizing the need to change the existing practice of penholding in the Security Council. The existing penholders often do a commendable job. However, a strong perception that they are using the pen to sustain a history of its use to pursue national interests is almost inevitable. Even when it is not the case, not least because of our increasing ability to inject misinformation and disinformation into the popular discourse. The immediate reform to address this is to ensure that all pens are sensitive to this reality. Existing pens should be subjected to a review by members of the Council and changes made. In addition, we urge that all new files from Africa have a member of the A3 or the collective as pens during their terms. This will better enable these members who are linked to the African Union's peace and security architecture to draft mandates and statements more in keeping with the required solutions, and to enjoy greater confidence by African members and our citizens whose security is directly at stake. It also means African states seeking membership will need to respond to the competencies and resources required to be an effective pen. Madam President, I conclude by reaffirming Kenya's commitment to the letter and the spirit of the UN Charter as applicable to all members in all situations. Thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Kenya for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Mexico.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mexico welcomes the fact that under its presidency, India has proposed this debate to collectively seek new and better ways to bring the multilateral system in line with the demands of the present time and the challenges ahead. We're grateful to the Secretary General and the President of the General Assembly for their interventions. Now, it is up to us, the members of the United Nations, to preserve and protect what has been successful and to reform what has not yet allowed us to achieve the legitimate aspirations embodied in the United Nations Charter and in the vast legal and institutional framework that underpins global governance. A superficial approach might suggest that we are facing a problem of institutional structure and that simply a reform of the Security Council would be the answer and perhaps the solution to the colossal challenges facing the United Nations system. However, a more rigorous analysis forces us to formulate a more severe but also a more accurate diagnosis. First of all, we must recognize that the multifaceted crisis that afflicts us results above all from the loss of confidence in the capacity of multilateralism as a method to respond to the countless situations that affect us all and that generate expectations for quick and effective solutions. This loss of global trust is reflected in an increasingly frequent recourse to unilateral decisions that in many cases seek to channel the frustrations and the despair of peoples towards alleged solutions that, due to their simplicity, might be attractive, but ultimately are not very effective. Comforted by certain endorsements of their population, some states have committed flagrant violations of their political and legal commitments and have withdrawn their support from the multilateral institutions that underpin them. In these times, it is impossible to talk about reforms to the multilateral governance system without highlighting the urgent need to address the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic that impacted unequally international economies and markets. Increasing inequalities among countries make the need to reform the international financial system even more urgent and to move towards a more inclusive, equitable, and fair model. That is, if we really want to leave no one behind. A new debt crisis is upon us. At least 54 countries are highly vulnerable to debt servicing and the extension of the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights. Furthermore, the G20 and OECD initiatives on moratoria and suspension of debt servicing have failed to provide real support to the most affected countries. Now, as a result of everything I mentioned, there are less resources now destined for economic and social development, and there is already backtracking in progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. The picture is further darkened by hate speech and unilateral sanctions that frequently affect the most vulnerable. Now, on the other hand, we must not forget that some situations inherited from colonial times, regional conflicts, religious-based wars, or ethnic rivalries, were able to find avenues for their solution in an unprecedented context of international cooperation embodied in the multilateral system. Furthermore, it must also be recognized that in the perception of public opinion, there is little distinction between the various organs of the multilateral system, or what it is in reality that prevents the Security Council from better fulfilling its responsibility. The United Nations and its institutional architecture as a whole are perceived by many as a stymied system and condemned to irrelevance. Such a perception, whether it's legitimate or not, is quite worrisome. Against this backdrop, it's illusory to think that the mere addition of more member states to the Security Council, and furthermore more permanent members, will magically generate the necessary consensus to allow the Council to fully discharge its mandate. As we stated during the debate under our presidency in November of last year, although the Security Council is the competent body to deal with threats to international peace and security, the United Nations system as a whole has a direct and indirect impact on the maintenance of peace. The interconnections between maintenance of peace and sustainable development and the rule of law are inescapable. Thus, the success of the Security Council in discharging its responsibility in accordance with its mandates depends to a large extent on not abusing the veto, indeed, but it also depends on the success of the General Assembly, success of the Economic and Social Council, and the International Court of Justice in fulfilling their own mandates, and also in conjunction with the work of the Secretary General. Therefore, it's necessary to create the social and economic conditions that are conducive to a truly sustainable peace. Therefore, a Security Council similar to the one we have today, but only with more members and perhaps with more vetoes, will not be the organ that could truly act on behalf of all the member states of the United Nations, as established in Article 24, Paragraph 1 of the Charter. A reform focused on increasing the number of permanent members is contrary to the principle of the legal equality of states. What is required is a reform that allows more countries, not less, to participate in the Council. Can we ignore the fact that nearly 70 states have never been members of the Security Council? Mexico supports and will support those proposals that consider an increase in the number of seats for elected members through periodic elections, not elections for perpetuity, and also under new modalities. For example, the mandate terms may last for longer periods and offer the possibility of immediate re-election as well. As in any democracy, those who serve on the Security Council must submit to periodic elections in the General Assembly to ensure genuine accountability. Undergoing periodic elections is the true test of accountability. In any case, this is a reform that can only be analyzed and discussed by the General Assembly. Mexico is convinced that we can move forward as long as we consider the collective interest and not just the interests of a few. The way to achieve this is nothing more than through a negotiation in good faith, oriented towards drafting a text containing the agreements that will be reached in a balanced manner and taking into account each aspect of the reform as established in the resolutions of the General Assembly. This approach and no other has been the method that has enabled the United Nations to agree on landmark treaties and reach agreements that have transformed the world. Thank you very much.
I thank the Ambassador of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President, and let me thank you and your team for organizing this important debate. I also thank the Secretary General Guterres and President of the General Assembly, Korosi, for their thoughtful remarks. Madam President, multilateralism brings together collaboration, inclusion, and solidarity. Together with diplomacy, they are central and essential to our collective efforts for peace and security in the world. At a time when key principles of the rules-based international order and essential instruments of international cooperation are challenged, we believe that strong and effective multilateralism based on the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, international law and justice is indispensable to secure peace, stability, and prosperity. Over decades, through efforts and dedication, we have together agreed to build a global security system based on the key principles such as territorial integrity and sovereignty of states, the peaceful resolution of disputes, the protection of human rights, sustainable development, and solidarity. Genuine commitment to multilateralism and joint efforts have contributed to hold this remarkable system together. Today, the biggest challenge is our ability to maintain the system, reform and adapt it to the changing times, and keeping it effective. As we know very well, it is not a given, and it requires continued devotion and sustained efforts. Madam President, unfortunately, as we have witnessed several times, multilateralism is not always synonym of success. It is so when the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism undermine effective decision-making. It is so when self-narrow interests prevent this very body to act and discharge its responsibilities. As a result, many conflicts remain unresolved, and we see that in Syria, Yemen, in Myanmar, to name a few, with thousands of civilians and entire communities suffering, which only highlights the limitations and the grave consequences when states act only in their own interests. In particular, the aggression in Ukraine has transgressed all these principles and rules. It has disregarded the UN Charter, has breached international law, and has broken the promise of peaceful settlement of disputes. It has also challenged multilateralism to its core and shattered the desire of nations to work together in peace and for shared benefits. This is why it has been crucial that, to a Security Council paralyzed by a blatant conflict of interests, the UNGA has responded decisively by confirming the sound moral grounds of a world that is not ready to condone aggression and accept annexation of territory by force. Together with the veto initiative, this has confirmed the necessity of a strengthened cooperation among the main organs of the organization and has contributed to revitalize and empower the General Assembly, the main deliberative body of the United Nations. This has clearly shown the imperative to improve the functioning of this Council and its ability to take action, remain credible, and act on behalf of the entire UN membership. Albania supports the comprehensive reform of the UN Security Council to make it more effective, transparent, democratic, representative, and accountable. As we all know, one of the key issues that affect the work and the efficiency of the Council remains the use, or better, the misuse of the veto. In this respect, Albania supports the efforts to restrain the use of the veto as contained in the French-Mexican initiative for cases of mass atrocities, as well as proposals contained in the Code of Conduct regarding Security Council action against genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes proposed by ACT. Madam President, The serious and multifold challenges of our time, by their nature and global scope, cannot be addressed by countries separately. The traditional challenges and risks to peace and security, amplified by new threats posed by the climate change, pandemics, cyber attacks, new types of weapons, non-state actors, terrorist groups, or mercenaries, do not affect one country alone. They transcend borders. Therefore, to prevent nuclear proliferation and usage, or to properly address threats linked to cyber warfare, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence, we must join hands to act together and find common solutions. We therefore need to rethink the future of UN operations so that they are fit for addressing the challenges, old and new. In this regard, we support the UN's general call for a new agenda for peace, and we recall that regional organizations can play also a key role in preventing and addressing crises. For Albania, preserving the values of multilateralism and international cooperation which underpin the UN Charter and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is fundamental. We cannot contemplate erosion of the values enshrined in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We cannot undo what we all together have meticulously built for common interest to create a more stable, fair and peaceful world for today and for tomorrow. We must not allow the UN system to lose its power and capacity to save lives, help those in need, and become inefficient, corroded by institutional sclerosis or ideological infighting. We must not let multilateralism become a stumbling hot air balloon. We need and want a more responsive, effective, and accountable UN that can deliver better and adapt to global challenges, an organization that strives for the full enjoyment of human rights everywhere, in particular by all women and girls in all their diversity and their empowerment. It is, in our view, the only way to respond to current and future challenges and invest in a better future for all. I thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Albania for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Norway.
Thank you, President, and thanks to the Indian Presidency for convening this meeting. We also thank the Secretary General and the President of the General Assembly for their briefings. You have both deftly illustrated the changing nature of our multilateral system, one which has served us well for more than 75 years. Many of the problems that face us today can only be solved through multilateral cooperation. Yet, multilateralism and multilateral institutions are under pressure. As a small state, Norway feels this acutely. In these turbulent times, we need a well-functioning and well-regulated international community where small and large states cooperate to find common solutions. Defending and strengthening international rule of law and multilateral cooperation is a core priority for Norway, and we have had the privilege to do so from our distinguished seat here in the Security Council for the past 2 years. While some may look to the Council and only see challenges, Norway sees the Council with a vital role in upholding international peace and security, and a significant, if often underutilized, capacity for preventive diplomacy and early action. It is with this perspective that Norway will continue to support the ongoing General Assembly discussion on comprehensive reform of the Security Council. Yet, to make the Council more effective, transparent, and accountable, there are steps we can and must take now that don't require amendments to the UN Charter. Let me outline 3 musts for Norway. First, the Security Council must hear from more and more diverse voices. We need to create a more inclusive multilateralism with a council that is more representative. We already see the vital role the A3 plays, and we commend them for voicing strong African positions in the Council. In a comprehensive reform, Norway staunchly supports increasing the number of permanent and non-permanent seats for Africa. But we must also work now to ensure broader ownership of Council decisions and products. We therefore support the A3's request to be pen holders or co-pen holders on African dossiers. We encourage A3 and indeed all E10 members to approach relevant permanent members for a more active role on relevant files. And we encourage the permanent members to constructively welcome this. Second, the Council must be more in touch with the direct impact of its decision on the lives of people on the ground. The Council should involve more and diverse civil society briefers, including women human rights defenders. This should be done in a systematically inclusive, safe, and meaningful way. The shared commitments on WPS have paved the way for this work. The Council should also draw more regularly on the expertise of human rights institutions and capacities within the UN system to detect situations which can develop into major security crises. Likewise, the Council would benefit from more informal situational awareness briefings from the Secretariat and Council visiting missions. Here we see great potential for impact through joint visiting missions, including with the AU Peace and Security Council. Third, the Council must be more connected with the rest of the multilateral system. The Council alone cannot resolve all challenges. We welcome the vital role of the General Assembly has played this year through uniting for peace, adopting and successfully implementing the veto initiative, and continuing work on the ACT Code of Conduct. There must be greater accountability and transparency around the use of the veto. The Council also needs to better align its work to other parts of the UN, like the Peacebuilding Commission, and with vital regional bodies like the AU. It should also be more vocal in its support to the good offices of the Secretary General. President, the very hallmark of multilateralism is to commit beyond one's own self-interest. Let us all use this occasion to recommit today. Thank you.
I thank the Ambassador of Norway for her statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of Gabon.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to congratulate India for the initiative of this important debate, which gives us an excellent opportunity to let our ideas ferment in order to reach a critical mass and thus allow us to shape a common future for us within the multilateral system. I thank the Secretary General of the United Nations and the President of the General Assembly for having certainly provided the orientation for our debate. Madam President, the United Nations is an idea of genius. It's a fantastic experience. I cannot imagine the world without the United Nations. It would certainly resemble a huge hunting range where nations are either hunters or are hunted. And in fact, one can only wonder if, to some extent, we are approaching this dark, somber canvas. Now, thanks to the United Nations system, today we have an international order based on rules. We have an outstanding architecture of collective peace and security. We have an ambitious program for sustainable development by 2030 and other roadmaps. Yes, we have the tools which are far from being deficient. The question is to figure out how to make these tools more relevant, more effective, and more adapted. How to reform our organization so that it is more efficient in assuring the security and dignity of the peoples of the world. Madam President, we must always remind ourselves that the United Nations were created with a clear goal of preserving future generations from the scourge of war, as stated in the preamble to the Charter. That was the brilliant idea of the victors of the Second World War, to which about 50 other states joined and adopted in San Francisco the Charter, which today constitutes the bond of our peaceful coexistence. Now, around 75 years later, the world has completely changed. The international context has completely changed. The geopolitical landscape has completely changed. The nature of wars has literally been transformed. Technology has completely upended our daily lives. Meanwhile, the structure of our institutions remains mainly unchanged, especially as far as our collective security. The democratic values sought and promoted by most states around the world at the national level have not been transposed to the global level, especially in terms of the composition and the functioning of the main seats and epicenters of the international, the current international order. It's as though democracy were the right thing for states and not necessarily the right thing for international organizations with a universal vocation. To take up the challenges of the future, our security architecture must reflect current realities and future challenges. We must effect an update of our international institutions, of our mentalities, of our perceptions of what a sustainable peace is, of what shared prosperity is, and what peaceful coexistence is. We must reinvent solutions to the contemporary threats such as climate change and threats to cybersecurity. We must confront the crisis of international solidarity which fuels underlying economic, humanitarian, sanitary, climate, or food crises. We cannot take up these challenges today using, that is, the challenges of the current century by using the tools of the previous centuries. Madam President, a continent such as Africa, which is the second most populated continent of the world, a continent which will, according to estimates, represent a quarter of the world's population by 2050, and which today represents about 70% of the agenda of the Security Council, that such a continent does not have a permanent seat within a body where issues that affect it are decided upon. Now, along the same line of thinking, other nations have legitimate claims to have a permanent seat at the main and decision-making table, which is the Security Council. Now, we are also convinced that it is time to act, to give concrete follow-up to three aspects that will make the multilateral system more credible and more effective. First of all, we must reform the Security Council without further ado. It must be representative of today's reality and of current challenges and future challenges. As an African, I hope that this reform will give priority to the common African position and its legitimate demand as reflected in the Ezulwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. Africa will not wait endlessly for the stops and starts of an intergovernmental reform process which to our peoples appears like an incessant distraction. As the president of Gabon recently stated forcefully, Africa will no longer wait. And at the end of the day, we will remember everyone who supported us, but also everyone who was indifferent or who maneuvered to keep Africa as a mere plaything to the major powers. Secondly, we must redefine the rules and mechanisms to confront the threats to our security and the threat of terrorism. As far as rules, we must ensure inclusivity and solidarity and leave no place for double standards, including the policy of solidarity with variable geography. Furthermore, we must specifically tackle the root causes of conflicts and crises. As far as our mechanisms for action, our response must be robust when needed and proportionate to the challenges on the ground. Thirdly, we must fashion a new social compact, a new global pact between generations, between governors and governed, between the global and regional level, by putting a particular stress on young people, women, civil society, and the private sector. In this new social compact for the future, bridges must everywhere replace walls. Education must everywhere beat back the trap of ignorance and intolerance. Multilateralism must prevail over unilateralist postures, and the logic of dialogue must constantly prevail over the logic of antagonism and the logic of zones of influence. It is illusory to think that humankind will survive with bubbles of security and prosperity surrounded by an ocean of insecurity and misery. The inevitable alternative to peace and prosperity for all will unavoidably be the endangering of all and the collective decline. We must, as a priority, as the priority of all priorities, set up a sturdy shield made up of initiatives in order to prevent and ban within the United Nations any predation of resources, any predation on human dignity, in order to give back to the peoples of the world their aspirations to security, to prosperity, and to a greater freedom. Madam President, to conclude, I would like to stress that we have an obligation to respond to current and future generations. We owe them a response that is commensurate to their fears, to their needs, and to their legitimate aspirations to live in peace with enhanced prospects. This response can no longer wait. Thank you very much.
Thank the Ambassador of Gabon for his statement, and I now give the floor to the Ambassador of the Russian Federation.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We would like to thank India for the choice of the theme of today's meeting. The world is going through difficult times. Crisis phenomena are on the rise, and the situation in the sphere of international security is deteriorating. The stance of a group of Western states to preserve their monopoly privileged position in the world is undermining confidence in international institutions as organs for agreeing on interests and in international law as embodied in the UN Charter, and to the UN-centric model of the world as such. And this is taking place not since February 2022. It is clear that today the question of the future world order is being decided, and the choice is clear. Either an order with a single hegemon that establishes rules that are only beneficial to it, or a democratic, multipolar, just UN-centric world without blackmail, domination, intimidation of the ill-favored, or neocolonialism. It's clear that those who are the main beneficiaries of this obsolete system aren't happy with that, and in trying to resurrect the unipolar model under the slogan of the rules-based order, the West is sowing dividing lines all over the place, trying to expand its sphere of interest to ever more regions of the world. Madam President, the Ukrainian crisis, which the collective West is doing everything it can to try and boil down to the beginning of our special military operation on the 24th of February, is just one of the elements of this multidimensional crisis that the world has been moving towards for a long time now. And this is a systemic crisis, the preconditions of which were formed gradually over the course of 2 or 3 decades. Having erected to the absolute level the rise of NATO to expand to the detriment of the principle of indivisibility of insecurity, Western countries have brought the European continent to the brink of a confrontation which could scorch the entire world. Moreover, today NATO is claiming to a global scope. A sensible dialogue in the run-up to the crisis was something that the West did not conduct, and it does not want to do it now either. In its means and methods for achieving its goals, the West is not skimping. Today, it has placed a wager on the exhaustion and strategic defeat of Russia. And if anybody believes that that began in February of this year, then they're mistaken. Just read the report of the RAND Corporation Center for Studies entitled Extending Russia Competing from Advantageous Ground. The report was issued in 2019, but it outlines everything that is being put into practice against Russia by the West today. And that applies actually not just to Russia. The tool used to coerce those who don't agree and who have found disfavor is unilateral sanctions, which have become the trademark and indeed the only tool in Western policy in recent years. Today, we can see a crisis not only in global security, but also in the system of international economic trade and financial relations. Just look at what's happening in the WTO. Only the laziest person would say that there was no need to reform international financial institutions today. We have long been saying that establishing confrontational concepts and the rules-based order, which we have heard about today, is being preserved as an integral part of the foreign policy strategy of the collective West. In practical terms, it is being advanced as a framework instrument to counter key trends in global development, the democratization of international relations and the formation of a multipolar world order. In trying to restore their dominating position and their single management of global processes, the USA and their satellites are betting on creating a broad coalition with the aim of targeting the main and new alternative centers of power. The conceptual rules-based order is drafted out of a map of the world that is boiled down to complex international processes, to primitive forms of the confrontation between democracies and authoritarian regimes. In the West, this is a crusade against autocracy, and they're trying to involve as many states as possible in that. In the context of this rules-based order, which has nothing to do with international law, and is in circumvention of universal structures and convention mechanisms, creates exclusive Western-controlled partnerships, various alliances, summits for democracies, and so on and so forth. They are intended, among other things, to have discussions on key issues on the global agenda in formats that do not include countries that have found their disfavor. And within these closed formats, these famous rules in various different parts of international life take place behind closed doors, and they are issued behind the scenes. All of these negative trends are found in a concentrated form within the UN. Today has been said, particularly today, about reform of the Security Council and about how allegedly it's not effective. This idea was something that we could have heard before at the dawn of the existence of the UN, and we've talked about it throughout the years of its existence. Of course, the Council and the UN in general needs to be adapted to modern realities. Without doing that, it's hard to imagine genuine representation and multipolarity and equality in the relations of member states. We see prospects for the democratization of the Security Council exclusively, and I underscore exclusively, through the expansion of representation of countries from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Today, the UN now more than ever needs to be protected by responsible member states. There is a need to rid the organization of everything that is confrontational, to restore its representation as a platform for frank discussions, to find mutually acceptable and respectful solutions, to achieve an unambiguous confirmation of commitment of everyone to all of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. It was with that aim in mind that in July 2021, the Group of Friends in Defence of the Charter was created, the co-founder of which was Russia, and which includes now around 24 countries. The group's aim is to ensure strict compliance with universal norms of international law as a counterweight to harmful unilateral approaches. We call upon everyone that agrees with this position to join it. Madam President, the task of building a genuinely multipolar world has no alternative. However, getting to that world is hardly going to be possible given division between nations and states, a crisis of confidence, and the build-up of the potential for confrontation in international relations. Humanity needs to learn from its own mistakes. It is unacceptable for the worst students of history that Indira Gandhi spoke of shamelessly try to impose on everyone else their solutions that only suit them. We must all be aware of our shared responsibility to create the conditions for the safe and harmonious development of future generations. We must clearly understand that the emergence of a genuinely inclusive multilateralism and the establishment of a polycentric world order and reform in the UN are interrelated processes. It is simply necessary to do away with phobias, stereotypes, all sorts of geopolitical games, to listen to and respect the interests and red lines of one another, and not when things have already got to the point of conflict, but when the alarm bells are rung. Russia was and remains ready to do that, and we expect others to do the same. Thank you.
I thank